Los Angeles, 1965. The city of dreams and neon lights, where palm trees sway against smog-filled skies and the sound of traffic hums like a restless heartbeat. But behind the glamour of Hollywood and the endless suburban streets, another world breathes in the narrow alleys of Pico-Union, a world of immigrants, broken English, and forgotten promises. It is here, on 18th Street, that a generation of young men found themselves invisible, and in their invisibility, they built an identity that would change history. They were children of exiles, sons of Mexican laborers, Salvadoran refugees, Guatemalan dreamers, kids who watched their parents clean the city that never saw them. They were too Mexican for the Americans, and too American for the Mexicans. The established gangs of Los Angeles, like Clanton 14, proud, territorial, and deeply traditional, did not want them. To the Chicano gangs, they were outsiders. To the police, they were just another brown face in a long line of suspects. That rejection became their fuel, the fire that forged what would become the 18th Street Gang, or, as it would later echo across borders, Barrio 18. The origin story is almost accidental, born not from ambition, but from exclusion. Some of these young men had tried to join Clanton 14, one of the oldest gangs in Los Angeles. But when they proposed to create a sub-clique named Clanton 18th Street, the idea was rejected. "You're not one of us," they were told. And so, in the silence that followed rejection, they decided to become something entirely new. They kept the number 18 as an act of defiance, a reminder of the street where they stood their ground. What started as a handful of kids hanging out on street corners soon evolved into one of the most feared organizations in America. At first, it was about survival. The city was changing. Waves of immigration reshaped its neighborhoods. Poverty was concentrated in pockets like Pico-Union, and police crackdowns turned communities into battlefields. The boys of 18th Street defended their blocks the only way they knew, with fists, knives, and eventually guns. Violence became language. Tattoos became armor. Their numbers grew fast because they broke one of the unspoken rules of Chicano gang culture. They welcomed everyone. Mexicans, Salvadorans, Guatemalans, Nicaraguans, even a few African Americans and Asian Americans. They called themselves homies, united not by bloodline, but by the same wound, being unwanted. By the 1970s, 18th Street was more than just a gang. It was an identity, a banner carried from neighborhood to neighborhood. Their graffiti, the now iconic 18 or 18th Street, began to appear on walls, bus stops, and abandoned buildings across Los Angeles. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a declaration of existence. Every spray of paint was a message. We are here. We belong. The gang spread rapidly through immigrant communities, offering protection, belonging, and status in a city that offered nothing else. For many young immigrants, joining 18th Street was not rebellion, it was survival. But with recognition came conflict. The gang world of Los Angeles was a web of alliances and vendettas, and 18th Street quickly found itself at odds with others, from the Mexican mafia's influence in prisons to street rivalries with gangs like the MS-13 that would erupt decades later. Their reputation hardened. They became known for being aggressive, unpredictable, and willing to fight anyone. Police reports described them as a virus spreading across the city. Sociologists studying urban crime in the 1980s later noted that 18th Street had the unique ability to recruit faster and wider than any other gang in California, precisely because of its inclusivity, a paradoxical weapon in a world built on division. Inside their world, loyalty was absolute. Betrayal was unthinkable. Many of the early members described the Brotherhood as a family that never judged. They celebrated together, fought together, and when one fell, others carried his name in ink on their skin. In the darkness of the alleys, under flickering streetlights, rituals were born. Initiation beatings, tattoos marking rank and allegiance, funerals that felt like sacred rites. Violence and belonging became indistinguishable. To be 18th Street meant you would die for the name because it was the only name that had ever accepted you. The police response was predictable and brutal. By the late 1970s, the LAPD's anti-gang units began sweeping through Latino neighborhoods, arresting anyone who matched the description of an 18th Street member, which often meant any young brown man in a baggy shirt. The repression only deepened the gang's mythos. The more the system tried to crush them, the more it confirmed the narrative that the world was against them. The jails of Los Angeles became recruiting grounds. Graffiti turned into gospel. When a member was killed, his funeral was both a mourning and a call to arms. Each coffin carried another reason to keep fighting. There's a haunting irony in how quickly the gang adapted to its own persecution. What began as kids fighting for dignity turned into an organization that survived precisely because it was persecuted. They learned to operate in the shadows, to use fear as defense and loyalty as currency. The city that rejected them had accidentally created one of the most resilient social structures of the 20th century's urban underworld. By the dawn of the 1980s, 18th Street was no longer confined to a few blocks. They had members in dozens of neighborhoods across Los Angeles County, from Hollywood to South Central, from Inglewood to East LA. Their code was spreading like wildfire, and yet, at its core, it still pulsed with that original wound, being outsiders among outsiders. What started as a gang had become a movement, raw, violent, and tragically poetic. In the city that promised everyone a dream, the kids of 18th Street found theirs in the only place that would have them, the streets. Their rise was just beginning. What no one could foresee was that the very system trying to contain them through mass incarceration and deportation would soon give them wings. From the alleys of Los Angeles to the prisons of California, from there to the streets of San Salvador and Tegucigalpa, the shadow of 18th Street would stretch farther than anyone ever imagined. But before that empire of fear was born, there was only a street, a number, and a promise. If no one else will give us a name, we will make one ourselves. By the late 1970s, Los Angeles had become a war map of invisible lines, blocks divided not by fences or geography, but by names whispered in fear. Don't walk down that street, mothers warned their sons. That's 18 territory. And within those streets, the 18th Street Gang was no longer a collection of lost boys. It had become an organism, breathing, growing, and mutating. Every tattoo, every tag on a wall, every whispered oath carried the same pulse, loyalty or death. To understand Barrio 18, you must understand that it was never just about crime, it was about belonging. For generations of immigrants and children of immigrants, the gang offered a sense of identity that the wider world had denied them. The gang was a mirror, reflecting both pride and pain. A member might say, 18th Street is my blood, not as metaphor, but as truth. Inside, there were codes more sacred than laws, rituals older than reason, and a loyalty that could both save and destroy. Recruitment was rarely forced. The streets did the work. A teenager abandoned by his father, bullied for his accent, pushed out of school, found the gang waiting with open arms. The initiation was simple, brutal, but symbolic. A group of members would form a circle, fists ready. For 18 seconds, one for each street number, the recruit would be beaten. If he stood up at the end, bloodied but unbroken, he was in. If he stayed down, he didn't belong. The ritual wasn't about punishment, it was a baptism. It said, "You've suffered like we all have. You can take the pain, you're one of us now." Once inside, every member learned the code of the 18. Respect the hood, never snitch, never back down. Protect your homies at any cost. The older members, known as OGS, Original Gangsters, were both mentors and enforcers. They taught discipline, loyalty, and the unwritten rule that once you joined, there was no leaving. La vida loca, they called it, the crazy life. It wasn't just a phrase, it was destiny. It meant accepting that your future was already written in the streets. The identity of the gang was carved into skin. Tattoos were the passport. The number 18, the Roman numerals STEET, or simply the word 18 became marks of allegiance. Some wore the image of the Virgin Mary alongside it, a contradiction that made perfect sense in their world. Sin and faith walking side by side. The tattoos told stories. Where you came from, what you'd done, and who you'd lost. The ink was language, each symbol a line in a sacred text of survival. The gang's organization was less chaotic than it appeared. It functioned like a family business, with hierarchy, responsibilities, and consequences. Each neighborhood had its cliques, semi-autonomous groups operating under the 18th Street umbrella. Each clique had a leader, lieutenants, foot soldiers, and young recruits. They controlled local drug sales, extortion rackets, and protection networks. Money flowed up, orders flowed down, and above all, there was a sense of belonging that replaced the absent father, the broken school, the silent state. But the code also demanded sacrifice. If one member disrespected the gang, if one turned on his brothers, punishment was swift and often terminal. The 18th Street Gang had learned from older organizations like the Mexican Mafia that survival required discipline. They enforced their rules not just with threats, but with blood. Betrayal was met with death. Cooperation with the police was unthinkable. Silence became sacred. Members often said, "You talk, you die." And it wasn't an exaggeration. It was policy. Women played a complicated role in this world. Some were girlfriends, others active members, homegirls, who earned their place through the same beatings and loyalty tests as men. They handled drugs, money, and even hits. But the environment was harsh, shaped by patriarchal codes and the violence of the streets. For many, it was both protection and prison, a place where love and fear blurred into the same emotion. As the gang grew, so did its mythology. In schools, in prisons, in the barrios, kids began to idolize the 18th Street name. It represented power, respect, and survival. Police reports from the 1980s described the gang as one of the most organized and violent groups in Los Angeles. To outsiders, they were criminals. To insiders, they were soldiers of the forgotten. Every clash with rivals, especially with Mara Salvatrucha, the rising MS-13, reinforced their identity as warriors of the 18th. The city became their battlefield, and loyalty became their weapon. The streets of Los Angeles in those years felt like a war zone. Helicopters hovered over neighborhoods like Pico-Union and Rampart. Sirens became the city's lullaby. The LAPD's anti-gang units, fueled by fear and frustration, began sweeping entire blocks, arresting anyone with tattoos or the wrong colors. But repression only strengthened the brotherhood. For every member arrested, 2 new ones joined. The gang learned to adapt, to operate under pressure, to survive in the cracks of society. Violence became both shield and sword. Inside prisons, the code evolved. The 18th Street Gang allied itself with the Mexican Mafia, La M.A., for protection, paying tribute to maintain their status behind bars. Those relationships would shape the future structure of organized crime in Los Angeles and beyond. The gang learned to communicate through coded messages, hand signs, and graffiti that doubled as intelligence networks. Every wall told a story, every letter carried meaning. But the code also trapped them. Once you became 18th Street, the world outside stopped existing. You couldn't just leave. Those who tried often met violent ends. To many, that was the cruel beauty of the brotherhood. It demanded everything: your loyalty, your freedom, sometimes your life. In return, it gave you purpose. It gave you a name that carried fear, respect, and immortality in the underworld of the city. Sociologists and anthropologists who later studied the gang saw it not just as a criminal enterprise, but as a social institution born from exclusion. The 18th Street Gang replaced what society had failed to provide: community, identity, belonging, and continuity. It turned broken lives into structure, chaos into order, and pain into power. Every rule, every act of loyalty, every violent response was part of a language built on centuries of marginalization. By the time the 1980s came to an end, the code of the 18 was unshakable. The gang had survived wars, police crackdowns, and internal purges. It had evolved from a local crew into a system, one that governed thousands of young men across Los Angeles. The city didn't yet know it, but the code that kept them alive would soon become the foundation for something much larger. When deportations began to send hundreds of these men back to their birth countries, they carried the code with them like a seed, one that would take root in new soil, watered by violence, and grow into a transnational empire. By the early 1980s, Los Angeles was losing control. The war on drugs, poverty, and race collided in the same neighborhoods that had birthed the 18th Street Gang. What began as a local defense group had now evolved into something far more dangerous: a structured underworld society that lived by its own rules. But it was the very system meant to destroy them, the prisons and deportation policies of the United States, that would transform Barrio 18 from a neighborhood gang into a criminal empire with roots that reached across borders and generations. When the Street Terrorism Enforcement and Prevention Act was passed in California in 1988, it gave the police unprecedented power to arrest and prosecute gang members. For the authorities, the goal was simple: crush the problem by locking it away. But they misunderstood the nature of what they were dealing with. The 18th Street Gang had grown up in the shadows of institutions that never accepted them: schools, churches, and now prisons. Inside, they adapted once more. The cells became classrooms, and the inmates became soldiers. The jails of California were a brutal ecosystem, governed not by guards, but by alliances. At the top of this invisible hierarchy sat La M, the Mexican Mafia, an organization that ruled with an iron fist from within the prison walls. Every Latino gang in Los Angeles eventually fell under their influence, and 18th Street was no exception. The IME demanded loyalty and tribute. In exchange, they offered protection and access. It was a devil's bargain, one that would forever intertwine 18th Street with the greater architecture of organized crime in America. Prisons turned out to be the perfect incubator for the gang's evolution. Behind bars, young members from different neighborhoods were forced into close quarters, stripped of freedom, but united by identity. They shared stories, strategies, and contacts. What had once been dozens of scattered cliques in Los Angeles began to coordinate. Rules became uniform. Communication systems emerged: coded letters, tattoos that conveyed rank, and a lexicon of hand signs that allowed them to move information under the watch of guards. The isolation that was meant to destroy them instead gave birth to structure. Meanwhile, on the streets, Los Angeles was burning. Crack cocaine flooded the city, and the economy of despair expanded. Gangs like 18th Street became both predators and providers, offering drugs, protection, and identity in exchange for obedience. Police repression only made them more sophisticated. Each arrest became a lesson, each sentence a training. The older members in prison began to guide the younger ones on the outside, creating a system of mentorship that mimicked military command. Orders came from behind walls, and blood was the only currency of enforcement. Then came the deportations, the unintended consequence that would reshape the entire hemisphere. During the 1990s, as part of the US, government's get tough on crime policy Thousands of undocumented immigrants convicted of felonies were sent back to their countries of origin. Among them were hundreds of 18th Street members, hardened by Los Angeles streets and California prisons. They boarded planes in handcuffs, with nothing but their tattoos and their code. When they landed in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, they brought with them a culture of violence, hierarchy, and discipline that those countries had never seen before. Central America was a perfect storm waiting to happen. Civil wars had just ended, leaving behind broken institutions, widespread poverty, and a generation of young men raised amid death and displacement. Into this vacuum stepped the deported gang members. They were organized, fearless, and equipped with a system that worked, the prison-based structure of Barrio 18. In neighborhoods of San Salvador and Tegucigalpa, they found recruits eager for belonging and governments too weak to stop them. What the United States saw as deportation, they experienced as expansion. The gang had just gone global. Inside the prisons of Los Angeles, leaders began coordinating with their counterparts in Central America. Smuggled letters, coded phone calls, and visiting relatives carried messages between worlds. La Onda, the wave, connected Los Angeles and San Salvador in an invisible current of crime and loyalty. 18th Street was no longer just a name. It had become a transnational identity. The same graffiti that covered walls in South Central could now be found in San Miguel and Choloma. It was globalization from below, violent, improvised, unstoppable. The authorities failed to see the transformation in time. For them, each deportation was a success story, one less criminal in the United States. But in reality, it was like scattering embers across dry grass. Each deported member became the nucleus of a new clicker. Within a few years, Barrio 18 was operating in 3 countries simultaneously, speaking the same language of survival and blood. And the prisons, both in the US and Central America, became their embassies. Prison hierarchies shaped everything. Inmates who had survived in facilities like Folsom or Pelican Bay brought with them a set of rules. No disrespect, no betrayal, absolute obedience to higher ranks. In El Salvador's overcrowded jails, these rules became law. Governments tried to contain the problem by isolating gang members in separate facilities, but that only backfired. Inside those walls, 18th Street leaders built schools of crime, organized recruitment, and controlled neighborhoods outside through cell phones smuggled by corrupt guards. Prisons were no longer punishment, they were headquarters. What had started as a gang born from exclusion had now become a self-replicating system of power. From the United States to Central America, Barrio 18 developed a 3-tier structure: local clickers on the streets, regional coordinators managing territories, and imprisoned leaders acting as generals. Money flowed upward through drug sales, extortion, and war taxes imposed on businesses. And though borders divided the maps, the gang functioned like one body. A command issued in Los Angeles could spark violence in San Salvador within hours. Sociologists later described this phenomenon as the globalization of street gangs, but for the men who lived it, it was survival by any means. Each arrest, each deportation, each prison sentence, instead of killing the gang, made it stronger. Like a virus adapting to medicine, it evolved. The streets taught them to fight, the prisons taught them to organize, and the deportations taught them to expand. The system that sought to destroy Barrio 18 had, in fact, built its empire. By the end of the 1990s, governments in both the US and Central America were facing something unprecedented: a decentralized, transnational criminal network that operated without borders, with its own code, communication, and identity. Law enforcement called it a plague. Historians would later call it an inevitability. The 18th Street Gang had become the unintended child of policy and poverty, forged in Los Angeles, refined in prison, and unleashed upon a continent. From the cells of California to the barrios of San Salvador, one truth became clear: Every wall that tried to contain them became another foundation stone of their empire. The bars of a cell were never a barrier, they were a blueprint. When the planes landed, no one paid much attention. The men who stepped off were handcuffed, tattooed, and silent, deported from Los Angeles to countries they barely remembered. Some spoke broken Spanish, others none at all. They had been born in Central America, but raised in the violent heartbeat of Los Angeles, molded by prisons and branded with ink that spoke louder than passports. Among them were hundreds of soldiers of the 18th Street Gang. The United States believed it was sending criminals away. In reality, it was exporting an idea, an identity, a code, a culture of survival that would soon ignite an entire region. In the early 1990s, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala were emerging from decades of civil war. The peace accords had been signed, the armies withdrawn, but the wounds of conflict ran deep. Cities were flooded with weapons, veterans, and orphans. Governments were weak, police forces undertrained, and economies shattered. Into this vacuum arrived the deportees, young men with the discipline of soldiers and the ruthlessness of survivors. They carried with them the organization of the Los Angeles streets and the law of the prisons. For them, the war had never ended. It had simply changed geography. The first members of Barrio 18 who arrived in San Salvador began as outsiders, just as they had once been in Los Angeles. Locals viewed them with suspicion, even fear. Their clothes, tattoos, and slang marked them as foreigners. But it didn't take long for them to find followers among the city's lost youth, the unemployed, the fatherless, the forgotten. In the crowded barrios of Soyapango, Mexicanos, and Ilopango, they offered the same promise they once offered in Pico-Union: protection, belonging, and a name. Soon, small groups began to form, taking up the banner of the 18. Graffiti appeared on cracked walls, City Teat, Barrio 18, and sometimes just a bold number painted in black. The language of Los Angeles had found new walls to speak on. At first, the authorities saw them as a nuisance, a foreign-style gang of petty criminals, but by the mid-1990s, that perception changed. The gang began to recruit aggressively, absorbing local street groups and teaching them the organizational discipline they had learned in American prisons. Initiations, tattoos, codes of silence, and territorial control all became part of the new order. In a country already traumatized by decades of warfare, this new form of conflict felt hauntingly familiar. It was as if the ghosts of the Civil War had put on different uniforms and returned to the streets. Barrio 18 didn't just bring violence, it brought structure. Each clique operated like a cell, autonomous but loyal to the larger whole. Older deportees acted as commanders while younger recruits served as soldiers. The gang quickly established hierarchies, set rules for punishment, and enforced control over neighborhoods through extortion, intimidation, and public displays of brutality. Businesses began paying la renta, a form of tax to operate within gang territory. Those who refused became examples, their stories whispered in fear, their bodies left as warnings. By the late 1990s, the influence of Barrio 18 had spread beyond El Salvador. In Honduras, deported members settled in Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula, cities already overflowing with poverty and violence. There they encountered a familiar rival, Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, also born in Los Angeles and also deported back. The two gangs had been enemies in California, and now, thousands of kilometers away, they resumed their war on new soil. The violence that had once defined Los Angeles' alleys now painted the streets of Central America in blood. Every neighborhood became a front line, every youth a potential recruit or casualty. Governments were unprepared. Police forces trained for political rebellion suddenly faced criminal armies with global connections. In many neighborhoods, gang members outnumbered law enforcement. They carried automatic weapons, established checkpoints, and imposed curfews. Entire communities lived under their rule, governed not by law, but by fear. The state's absence was absolute. For many families, it was safer to obey the gang than to call the police. A new social order had emerged, one that blurred the line between gang and government. The power of Barrio 18 grew through communication and diaspora. Members deported from Los Angeles maintained contact with those still in California through letters, phone calls, and later, the internet. Money flowed between both worlds, from the drug trade, from extortion, from remittances laundered through family networks. A command in Los Angeles could trigger an execution in San Salvador, and a killing in Tegucigalpa could spark retaliation in LA. The gang had transcended borders. It was now a transnational organism, breathing through migration and fed by despair. Sociologists began calling it the transnationalization of crime. But for those who lived it, it was simply survival on a larger stage. The same reasons that had created Barrio 18 in Los Angeles, exclusion, poverty, racism, now thrived in Central America. In some barrios, joining the gang wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. The police treated every poor youth as a suspect, and rival gangs hunted those who refused to join. The cycle repeated itself with brutal precision. Fear created violence, violence created belonging, and belonging created control. By the 2000s, Barrio 18 had become one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Central America. Reports from the United Nations estimated tens of thousands of members across El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. The gang's influence reached into prisons, police departments, and even politics. In some towns, mayors negotiated directly with gang leaders to maintain peace. In others, the gangs acted as the real government, collecting taxes, settling disputes, and enforcing their version of justice. The irony was bitter. The children of migrants who once sought refuge in the United States were now ruling territories with the same violence that had driven their families north in the first place. The imagery of the gang, the tattoos, the graffiti, the street code, became part of Central American culture. Music, clothing, and even religion adapted to its presence. Pastors opened churches for gang members seeking redemption, while funeral homes filled with the young and the marked. Journalists who dared to investigate paid with their lives. And yet amid the chaos, many members still saw themselves as victims of circumstance. "We didn't create this world," one former 18th Street member told a reporter in San Salvador. "We just learned how to survive in it." By the time the 2010s arrived, Barrio 18 had split into factions, the Revolucionarios and the Sureños, each claiming legitimacy, each perpetuating the same cycle of blood. Governments launched militarized crackdowns known as mano dura, iron fist, filling prisons with tens of thousands of suspected gang members. But the result was predictable. Prisons once again became command centers, where leaders directed operations outside through smuggled cell phones and visitors. The harder the state hit, the more the gang adapted. Violence was their language, and the state had only taught them new dialects. In less than 2 decades, a group born in the forgotten corners of Los Angeles had transformed into a multinational power. What the United States thought it was deporting as a problem, it had exported as a blueprint. Barrio 18 had become more than a gang. It was a symbol of how societies fail their own children. In the ruins of post-war Central America, that failure took physical form. A brotherhood born from rejection, nurtured by survival, and spread by policy. The fire that began on a single street in Los Angeles now burned across 3 nations. It leapt from alley to alley, fueled not by ideology, but by the simple, devastating truth that when people have nothing to lose, they will build an empire from the ashes. By the turn of the millennium, two names had come to define the fear that stalked Central America's streets: Barrio 18 and Mara Salvatrucha, better known as MS-13. Both born in the immigrant barrios of Los Angeles, both forged in the fires of poverty and exclusion, and both deported back to the broken landscapes of Central America. They were brothers by origin, but enemies by blood. The war between them would not be fought for ideology or politics. It was a war for identity, for control, for the right to exist. It would span decades, consume generations, and paint borders red from Los Angeles to San Salvador. In the beginning, the rivalry was local. Two street gangs fighting for the same neighborhoods in Los Angeles during the 1980s. Barrio 18, already dominant in many Latino districts, saw MS-13 as an upstart composed largely of Salvadoran refugees. To 18th Street, they were newcomers. To MS-13, they were oppressors. The first clashes were simple: fists, knives, an occasional gun. But when these wars crossed the prison walls, they transformed into something far deadlier. The Mexican mafia forced both gangs under its influence, demanding tribute and enforcing discipline. Yet even inside the same cells, the hatred between them could not be contained. The rivalry became ritual, passed down like inheritance. When the deportations of the 1990s sent thousands of members from both gangs back to Central America, they carried that hatred with them. In the crowded barrios of San Salvador, Tegucigalpa, and Guatemala City, they recognized each other instantly. The same tattoos, the same slang, the same coded gestures, mirrored reflections from opposite sides of the same broken mirror. Each saw in the other what they despised about themselves: poverty, pain, and the face of rejection. What began as a Los Angeles feud would now evolve into one of the most violent social conflicts in modern history. The battle lines were drawn. Barrio 18 controlled neighborhoods like Mexicanos and Soyapango. MS-13 held Ilopango and Apopa. Every wall was a map, every piece of graffiti a declaration of war. Crossing into the wrong territory could mean death. Ordinary citizens became collateral: bus drivers who refused to pay extortion, students wearing the wrong color, children who lived on the wrong block. Violence became territorial, intimate, and unending. The sound of gunfire was as common as church bells. Governments tried to intervene. In El Salvador, the mano dura, iron fist, policy promised to crush the gangs through mass arrests. Thousands of suspected members were rounded up and thrown into overcrowded prisons. But instead of weakening the gangs, the policy strengthened them. The prisons became their command centers, the walls became their shields. Inside, Barrio 18 and MS-13 organized themselves with military precision. Each cell block turned into a miniature government, complete with rules, taxes, and internal courts. They even held negotiations with the outside world through smuggled phones and corrupt guards. The more the state fought them, the more structured they became. By the late 2000s, the war had consumed entire regions. In Honduras, especially in San Pedro Sula, violence reached apocalyptic levels. The city became one of the murder capitals of the world. Police refused to enter certain neighborhoods after dark. Journalists vanished for reporting on the conflict. Graffiti marked invisible borders. A child could not walk to school without risking crossing from 18th Street territory into MS-13 land. Families fled north, chasing the same dream that had once brought their ancestors to Los Angeles, unaware that the same gangs now ruled the migrant routes, charging protection fees on the way. The rivalry was not only about territory, it was about identity. Barrio 18 called itself the People's Gang, priding itself on discipline and hierarchy. MS-13 saw itself as a family bound by ritual and mysticism, invoking saints and demons alike. Each adopted its own iconography: the number 18 versus the number 13, the Roman numerals, the hand signs shaped like secret prayers. The tattoos were scripture written on skin. The battlefield was not just physical, but spiritual. To kill the enemy was not only to protect your neighborhood, it was to defend your very existence. In Los Angeles, meanwhile, the war echoed like a ghost of its own creation. Immigrant families watched news from their homelands showing massacres committed in the names of gangs that had started on their own streets. Police in California and federal agencies such as the FBI classified both 18th Street and MS-13 as transnational criminal organizations. Task forces hunted them from the barrios of Pico-Union to the suburbs of Long Island. Yet despite decades of crackdowns, deportations and anti-gang initiatives, the cycle endured. Every arrested member became a martyr, every deported one a seed. The rivalry's cruelty reached new depths in the 2010s. Both gangs developed internal factions, Barrio 18 Revolucionarios versus Sureños, MS-13 Normandy versus MS-503, each claiming to be the true heir of the original code. The fights no longer stopped at borders or even within factions. Betrayal became a second war. In El Salvador, videos of executions spread online like warnings. Bodies left in rivers, bus burnings, and entire families slaughtered for breaking the gang's rules became daily headlines. Then came President Nayib Bukele's declaration of war against the gangs. In 2022, after a series of massacres, his government launched an unprecedented state of emergency. Tens of thousands of alleged gang members were arrested and packed into colossal prisons built specifically for them. Images of tattooed men in white boxes, shackled and crouched, circled the globe. To some, it looked like justice. To others, like the birth of a new kind of authoritarianism. Barrio 18 and MS-13 were cornered, but not erased. They had been caged before, and they had always adapted. The human cost of the war was immeasurable. Mothers buried sons on opposite sides of the same conflict. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but fear. In the poorest barrios, the distinction between 18th Street and MS-13 became meaningless. Both were simply La Mara, the gang, the economy of extortion, the culture of silence, the ever-present threat of violence became part of daily life. Sociologists described it as a war without ideology, a self-perpetuating machine powered by trauma and poverty. And yet, even within that darkness, stories of resistance emerged. Former members joined rehabilitation programs, artists painted over gang graffiti with murals of peace, pastors opened churches that doubled as sanctuaries. But leaving the gang was still a death sentence. The code that once promised belonging now chained its members to a life of perpetual fear. For everyone who escaped, 10 more took his place, drawn not by greed, but by the same hunger for identity that had birthed the first members on 18th Street half a century before. Across the ocean of time and geography, the rivalry between Barrio 18 and MS-13 stands as one of the most haunting legacies of modern migration. It is a mirror reflecting what happens when societies abandon their youth, when poverty, displacement, and prejudice conspire to create soldiers out of children. The bullets that echo in San Salvador and Los Angeles are the same. Only the language of their screams changes. By the 2020s, the war had no victor, only survivors. Governments claimed success with mass incarcerations, but the deeper wounds remained untouched: inequality, hopelessness, and the absence of belonging. The battle that began in a forgotten corner of Los Angeles had become a continental tragedy, a looping story of exile and revenge. And somewhere, in a dark cell or a silent barrio, an old tattoo fades under time's weight, whispering a truth both gangs have always known. The war never ends, it only changes names. The sun rises over San Salvador, and for a moment, the city looks peaceful. The markets open, buses roar to life, and children walk to school under a sky that seems indifferent to history. But beneath the calm, there's a silence too practiced to be natural, the kind that only comes from fear. On these streets, Everyone knows where not to go, which colors not to wear, which names not to speak. The war between Barrio 18 and MS-13 may no longer make headlines every day, but its ghost still lingers in every shadow, every whispered prayer. The empire of fear they built continues to rule, even without a crown. For decades, governments promised salvation through force. They built walls, prisons, and policies meant to crush the gangs. In El Salvador, President Nayib Bukele's state of exception became the most radical example. More than 80,000 people arrested, entire neighborhoods emptied, and a new mega prison designed to hold the most feared men in the country. The images went viral: rows of tattooed inmates, heads shaved, bodies bent forward in submission, their skin covered with the inked symbols of the past. Sostint, MS, names that once defined power now branded as marks of shame. To some, it was justice finally served. To others, it was vengeance dressed as order. But history has a way of repeating itself. The same prisons that once incubated Barrio 18 and MS-13 in the 1980s and 1990s are now fuller than ever. Behind those walls, thousands of young men sit in silence, stripped of weapons, but not of memory. Each one carries the story of a life where choice never existed, where the gang was the only family that would take them in. Sociologists warn that suppression without rehabilitation is only a pause, not a cure. You can cage the men, one Salvadoran criminologist said, but you cannot cage the reasons they were born. The gang's shadow extends beyond prison walls. Even as leaders are captured, networks survive, reshaped, disguised, evolving like organisms under pressure. New generations inherit the structures left behind. Some of these successors are quieter, less visible, operating through extortion, cybercrime, and money laundering instead of open warfare. They understand that fear doesn't always need gunfire. Sometimes silence is more profitable. Others, however, cling to the old codes, the tattooed loyalties, the brutal identity of the streets. Between both worlds, the modern and the old, lies a dangerous equilibrium, one that keeps communities hostage to a peace that isn't peace at all. And then there's faith, the one weapon that neither bullets nor laws have been able to suppress. In the same neighborhoods once dominated by gangs, churches now echo with the voices of former members seeking redemption. Pentecostal pastors, many of them ex-gangsters themselves, preach about forgiveness and transformation. Tattoos fade under long sleeves, and the same hands that once pulled triggers now raise Bibles. These churches of the Moreros have become sanctuaries for those trying to escape a life that rarely lets anyone leave alive. But even here, fear follows. Rival gang members often view conversion as betrayal, and the state itself doesn't always distinguish between believer and criminal. Redemption has a price, and in some places it's death. Still, hope persists. NGOs, educators, and social workers risk their lives daily to offer alternatives to the next generation. They teach art, music, carpentry, anything that gives young people a reason to exist outside the gang's grip. Yet progress is fragile. Poverty, unemployment, and displacement continue to feed the same hunger that once gave rise to the 18th Street Gang in Los Angeles. Migration remains a constant. Each year, tens of thousands of Central Americans flee north, escaping the violence born from the very systems that failed them. And in a cruel twist of irony, many of their children now grow up in the same American neighborhoods where it all began. The same streets of Pico-Union and South Central, where the number 18 first became a symbol. For the United States, the legacy of Barrio 18 is both foreign and domestic. The gang's presence is still strong in California, Texas, Illinois, and New York, often tied to drug distribution, extortion, and human trafficking. Federal task forces call them a decentralized network of hyper-local violence. But behind every statistic lies a story. A teenager searching for identity, a refugee searching for safety, a system that never had a place for either. Decades of deportation have created a revolving door of exile and return. A boy born in El Salvador joins a gang in Los Angeles, gets deported, spreads it in Central America. His son migrates years later, and the circle continues, generation after generation. Yet, beneath the statistics and the fear, there is a deeper truth. Barrio 18 was never just a gang. It was a reflection of everything society refused to see. Poverty, racism, exile, the collapse of community, these were the real architects of the empire. The tattoos, the guns, the codes were only symptoms. Every homie who joined did so because he was already invisible. And invisibility breeds rebellion. As long as there are streets filled with forgotten children, the number 18 will never truly die. It may fade from walls, but it survives in hearts, as memory, as warning, as identity. In recent years, the gang's violence has decreased in visibility, but not in consequence. Analysts debate whether the decline is real or simply driven underground by the state's brutal repression. Bukile's government claims to have erased the maras, pointing to falling homicide rates and restored public spaces. But families of detainees tell another story, of innocent men taken without due process, of torture, of collective punishment. The same machinery that once failed to protect now risks becoming the new face of terror. The question is no longer whether the gangs still exist, but what kind of society survives in their absence. In Los Angeles, the story feels cyclical. The murals of the Virgin Mary still guard the corners of Pico-Union. The graffiti fades, painted over by time, but under the paint lies the same message: belonging costs blood. Former gang members run community programs, trying to guide new generations away from the mistakes they once made. They speak to classrooms, prisons, and youth centers, their voices trembling between regret and wisdom. "We were never the cause," one ex-member says in a documentary. "We were the effect." And maybe that's where the story ends, not with a victory or defeat, but with understanding. The 18th Street Gang was born from rejection, raised by survival, and spread by policies that never saw the humanity behind the violence. Its empire was built not by kings, but by orphans of circumstance. To erase it, the world would need to erase the very conditions that created it: inequality, exclusion, and despair. Until then, the shadow remains. As night falls over San Salvador once more, the city lights flicker like candles against the dark. Somewhere, behind high prison walls, a man prays. Somewhere else, a boy stares at a blank wall, a can of spray paint in his trembling hand. The number he's about to write is older than him, older than the war, older than hope itself. It is not just a symbol, it is a story. And stories, once born, do not die. They only wait for someone new to tell them. If this story moved you, don't just watch it, understand it. Subscribe for more true stories that reveal the hidden forces shaping our world. Tell us in the comments, do you believe redemption is possible for those raised in violence? Turn on notifications to follow the next investigative series, because every shadow has a history, and every history deserves to be told.